Hi, everyone. Welcome to Family Matters. I am Dr. Dilsora Fozilova. And today's class, we will be talking about first families in Canada, focusing on Indigenous families, family life, and pre and post Confederate Canada. So by the end of this lecture, I want you to have a good idea about the definitions of Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples, their anthropological history of Canadian families, starting with hunting and gathering and colonization, and then Indian Act and residential schools and acculturation and assimilation, and how this all affected Indigenous families in Canada. And then we will be talking about the Indigenous families today, and we will be finishing this video by redressing historical injustices. I have two videos in this lecture, and I hope you will stop and watch them, or you will just watch them in your own time. All right, let's get started. So, Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples, what does it mean? Indigenous peoples, and I am not assuming that you don't know this, but I'm just reviewing it with you. Indigenous peoples are also referred to as Aboriginal peoples in some regions, like in Canada, are the original inhabitants of the land, the Canadian land or territory, having lived prior to colonization or the establishment of modern states by other groups. They are distinct from the dominant or settler populations that later occupied their lands through colonization, migration, and conquest. So, some of the key characteristics of Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous people have long-standing ties to specific territories, cultures, and ways of life that predate colonialism or modern state formation. They often maintained distinct languages, distinct cultures, customs, traditions, and social systems that set them apart from the dominant society. So, Indigenous communities see their identity as deeply connected to their ancestral lands, which they often view not just as a resource, but as sacred and integral to their culture and worldview. Indigenous people often they prefer the term given to government's usage of the label Aboriginal. So the colonial history impacted Indigenous groups have typically experienced, they experienced displacement, marginalization, and systemic discrimination due to colonization and modern state expansion. Indigenous peoples' histories often involve rich and complex societies with advanced systems of governance, trade, and knowledge long before contact with colonizers. Colonization disrupted their societies, as I mentioned earlier. It led to land disposition. Indigenous territories were often taken through treaties, force, or deceit. It led to cultural suppression. Colonizers imposed their languages, religions, and customs, often outlawing Indigenous practices. Also, it led to population decrease because of the diseases, warfare, and systemic violence drastically reduced Indigenous populations. The contemporary issues today, many Indigenous communities still face challenges stemming from historical and ongoing inequalities, which we will be discussing later. There's still marginalization, social, political, and economic exclusion often leaves Indigenous groups underrepresented in governance and disadvantages in education, healthcare, and employment. And cultural preservation, efforts to preserve indigenous languages, traditions, and knowledge systems are critical as many are at risk of extinction. So when we think about indigenous languages, there are so many of them, and many of them actually disappearing, which is a very sad story. Many indigenous groups seek recognition of their right to self-govern and maintain their cultural practices without external interferences. They also have made significant contributions to global culture, knowledge, and sustainability practices, their approaches to land management and conservation, and increasingly recognized as values in addressing environmental challenges such as climate change. So indigenous languages, art, music, and storytelling enrich global heritage, and many indigenous philosophies emphasize interconnectedness, reciprocity, and balance with nature, offering alternative models to Western individualism and materialism. There is efforts to protect and empower indigenous peoples have gained traction globally. Some of them are United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007. It affirms indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, land, culture, and resources. Also, we have Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Process like those in Canada aim to address historical injustices, including the legacy of residential schools and so on. So indigenous or Aboriginal peoples are integral to the cultural, historical, and ecological fabric of the world. While they have faced centuries of colonization and systemic oppression, their resilience and efforts towards self-determination continues to inspire global movements for equity, cultural preservation, and environmental stewardship. So those are the very, very important parts of Canadian culture. So they also have different languages. I don't think I have a slide for that. No. They have different languages. They have way many different groups. We can talk about like three of them. The first inhabiting families of Canada refer to the Indigenous peoples who have lived in Canada for thousands of years before the arrival of European settlers. And these indigenous groups are generally categorized into three broad groups: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And I want to go through a little bit talking about each of them. The First Nations are the original inhabitants of much of Canada's landmass, living in various regions from coast to coast with distinct cultural practices, governance systems, and languages. So they, First Nations peoples occupied diverse ecological regions, leading to different cultural adaptations, known for complex social structures with rich traditions like totem pole carving, and then hunter-gatherers with a focus on certain kinds of hunting, like a bison hunting in mobile lifestyle. And there were woodland nations, expert foreign navigators with substance based on hunting, fishing, and gathering. And Inuit, the Inuit are also another group in indigenous culture. They are peoples of the Arctic regions of Canada, primarily living in Inuit, Northwestern Territories, northern Quebec and Labrador. They are distinct from First Nations in culture, language, and geographic locations. They lived in extreme Arctic environments, relying on hunting marine mammals like seals, whales, and fish for sustenance. Their language, the language they speak was Inuktitut, I believe. And it's another dialect of the Inuit language family. Medi people, on the other hand, are distinct groups of indigenous people. They emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries through intermarriage between European settlers, usually French and Scottish fur traders and First Nations women. They developed their own unique culture, language, and identity. They were concentrated in the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, but also present other places in Canada. The Métis culture blends indigenous and European traditions, particularly music, art, dance, and braid work, and all of those stuff. And their language is Michif, that combines the elements of French and Cree. So then, hunting and gathering families, 99% of human history involved with hunting and gathering, and so did indigenous families. Groups comprised of one or two families. They lived in groups, developed shared economies and leadership based on residence, gender, age, and ability. So those were some of the elements of indigenous families. And in the first indigenous families are believed to have arrived in Canada approximately 15,000, 20,000 years ago via Bering Land Bridge, a land connection between Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age. Over time, they spread across the continent, forming diverse cultures and adapted to local environments. I think I had this in different slide. Yes. So more than 300 nations existed with unique histories, language, and cultures. So significant archaeological sites such as Clovis culture and remains in places like Haida, Gwaii, and Bluefish Caves attest to the long history of indigenous occupation in Canada. So the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century disrupted their lives. As I mentioned, there was land disposition, colonization often displaced indigenous communities from their ancestral territories. There was diseases that contact with European families. Europeans brought diseases like smallpox, which devastated indigenous families, and also assimilation policies, the efforts to assimilate indigenous peoples into settler culture, such as through residential school system aimed to erase their cultural identities. So there are, I'll go back to this slide now. The arrival of Europeans in the late 1500s and early 1600s marked a significant turning point in the history of indigenous peoples. This period saw the establishment of trade networks, settlements, and the imposition of European cultural, economic, and social systems. This consequences. The consequences for indigenous families and societies were profound and long lasting. And Cartier voyage in the 1530s and 1540s under the Commission of France marked the beginning of European exploration and claims to land in Canada. While Cartier initially sought to route to Asia, his interactions with indigenous people laid the groundwork for future French settlement and resource exploitation. Excuse me. And then by the 1600s, French settlers, including Acadians, began to establish agricultural communities in trading posts, particularly in regions such as modern-day Nova Scotia and Quebec. These settlers relied heavily on trade relationships with indigenous groups, exchanging European goods for fur and other resources. So there was also, during the 17th, 18th century, settlers from British Isles and Germany also migrated to what is now Canada. Their arrival introduced competing colonial powers, each seeking alliances with indigenous groups and economic and military advantage. So the fur trade and indigenous dependence started with the establishment of trading posts, creating strong economic ties between Europeans and indigenous communities. Indigenous groups provided furs in exchange for European goods like firearm, metal tools, alcohol, and textiles. This textile initially straightened some indigenous communities by providing new tools and technologies, but eventually led to economic dependence on European goods. So there was all different kinds of changes happening in indigenous communities, and there was a lot of influence from European ideals. For example, European ideals of patriarchy and unequal spousal relationships, which wasn't the case in indigenous families, premarital chastity, marital fidelity, male courtship, male dominance. Those were all European nature, European culture, and most indigenous families never accepted these values anyways. So Europeans also brought indigenous families social and cultural norms that were rooted in, these norms. The patriarchy, especially, men held authority within households and communities, dominating decision making and property ownership. Women were expected to be submissive and confined to domestic roles. Unequal spousal relationships, for example, husbands were regarded as head of the households, which wasn't the case in indigenous families, while wives were seen as dependents. Marriage was primarily a social and economic contract rather than egalitarian partnership. So all of those was new for indigenous families. So most indigenous families did not accept, as I mentioned, these European norms, as they contradicted their long-standing cultural practices and beliefs. Many indigenous societies were matriarchal and or had complementary gender roles, where women held significant influence in family, community, and governance. Women often controlled the resources such as land and food, and had decision-making power in marriages and child rearing. Also, indigenous families emphasized extended kinship networks, which provided social and economic support beyond the nuclear family structure. So many indigenous cultures practiced customary marriages, which were based on mutual agreement rather than religious ceremonies. Divorce was often acceptable and straightforward, allowing individuals to leave relationships that were no longer functional or harmonious for them. And indigenous people often viewed relationships and social organizations through the lens of balance and reciprocity rather than dominance and submission. Um, the European patriarchal values were seen as oppressive and contrary to the indigenous principles of mutual respect. So there was a shift, there was influence. The introduction of European ideals and institutions led to significant disruptions. Over time, colonial governments imposed European family structures and gender roles through policies such as Indian Act in Canada. This laws sought to enforce patriarchal norms and undermine indigenous governance. Also, there was the residential schools. They actively attempted to erase indigenous cultural practices, including traditional family structures, and then and values in indigenous the children. Marginalization of women became a huge deal. Indigenous women who often held positions of power in their communities were marginalized under European systems that excluded them from leadership roles and undermined their autonomy. The fur trade and other colonial economic systems disrupted traditional subsistence practices, creating dependency on European goods and destabilizing indigenous communities. The European conquest brought profound changes to the lives of indigenous peoples in Canada. While trade and settlement initially fostered collaboration and mutual benefit, the imposition of European cultural norms, patriarchy, and colonial systems led to the marginalization of indigenous families and the erosion of their traditional ways of life. Despite these challenges, many indigenous communities resisted and continue to resist these ideals, preserving their cultural practices and striving for self-determination in the face of ongoing colonial legacies. So also there is Europeans, when they arrived approximately, when was that? Representing the representation of more than 300 distinct nations at that time with diverse language, histories, and cultural practices was kind of too difficult for colonizers. Colonization began in 15th century, brought significant disruption to indigenous families. And pre-colonization, indigenous families had kinship systems. They were typically organized around extended kinship networks that emphasized community well-being over individual ownerships. The gender roles were different, women often holding significant authority, cultural practices were different, and these changes caused a lot of grievances for indigenous families. So also the conquest or the colonization disrupted the kingship systems, the imposition of European norms eroded extended family networks central to indigenous societies, and marginalization of women. Also, the indigenous women lost autonomy as European patriarchal systems devalued their traditional roles, and there was a cultural suppression. Of course, they lost their traditions, governance systems were undermined, and the colonial assimilation policies. So then, Indian Act of 1976. The Indian Act of 1976 is a foundational piece of Canadian legislation that governs the relationship between Canadian government and Indigenous people. It often referred to as Indian in the Act. It consolidated previous colonial laws and remains a highly controversial law due to its role in enforcing colonial control, assimilation, and discrimination against Indigenous peoples. So, what was the purpose of Indian Act? The Act legally categorized who qualified as an Indian under Canadian law. It established the framework for the administration of reserves and restricted Indigenous landowners. And also, it sought to erode Indigenous cultures and integrate Indigenous peoples into settler society by enforcing European norms and values. So, main purpose of Indian Act was to define Indigenous identity, control Indigenous land and resources, and assimilate Indigenous peoples. The Act introduced the concept of Indian status, determining who was legally recognized as an Indian based on the patrilineal descent. Women who married non-Indigenous men lost their status, as did their children, effectively excluding them from their communities. Also, Indigenous peoples were confined to specific areas of land known as reserves. Reserve lands were held in trust by the Crown, and Indigenous peoples could not own or sell reserve lands. They also, Indigenous self-governance was severely restricted. The Act imposed elected chief and council systems, replacing traditional governance structures. So there's a lot was going on in this Act. Also, some of the stuff about Act was it was also cultural suppression, the banning of ceremonies, language, and traditions, which led to significant cultural erosion, disruption of families, that policies, including residential schools, separated children from their families, causing intergenerational trauma. The inability to own reserve land or engage in economic activities created systemic poverty in many Indigenous communities. Also, the loss of sovereignty, the traditional governance systems were replaced with structures imposed by the Canadian government. Indian agents wielded significant power, controlling almost every aspect of reserve life. So there is many criticisms towards the Indian Act. Some of them is racist and discriminatory, and then assimilationist and paternalistic. Those are some of the criticism towards Indian Act. When we talk about racist and discriminatory act, it enforces colonial definitions of identity and denies Indigenous autonomy. And you can ask why assimilationist Its policies aim to erase indigenous cultures and integrate indigenous peoples into settler society. And it treats indigenous people as wards of the state, stripping them of autonomy. So, in conclusion, that the Indian Act of 1876 was a tool of Canadian control and assimilation designed to enforce European values and erode indigenous cultures and autonomy. Its legacy is deeply tied to systemic inequalities faced by indigenous peoples in Canada today. While it remains in force, ongoing efforts to recognize indigenous self-determination and sovereignty aim to address its historical and contemporary impacts. And residential schools. There was two primary objectives to residential schools. Residential schools was basically started in 1840s and lasted until 1996. Residential schools were government-sponsored and church-operated institutions in Canada, aimed at assimilating Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. These schools operated between the late 19th century and 1996, with their most extensive impact occurring in the mid-20th century. So primary objectives. Assimilation into European Canadian society was number one objective of residential schools. The primary goal was to assimilate children into dominant Euro-Canadian culture by erasing their Indigenous identities, language, and traditions. The federal government believed that Indigenous peoples should abandon their ways of life and adopt European values, customs, and Christianity. And schools banned the use of Indigenous languages and the practice of traditional ceremonies, forcibly replacing them with European customs and beliefs. Children were often punished for speaking their native languages or engaging in cultural practices. Also, religious conversion was one of the important objectives. The schools were primarily operated by Christian churches like Catholic, Anglican, and Methodist, aiming to convert Indigenous children to Christianity. Indigenous spirituality beliefs were denounced as pagan or uncivilized, and disruption of family and community bonds was another objective of these residential schools. The government believed that removing children from their families and communities was essential for assimilation. Children were placed in schools far from home to sever ties with their families and kinship networks. This separation disrupted the transmission of cultural knowledge and traditions. Also, the schools emphasized vocational training, preparing boys for manual labor, farming, carpentry, and girls for domestic work like sewing, housekeeping. The aim was to integrate Indigenous children into the lower tiers of the labor market, ensuring they remaining economically and socially subordinate so they can control them. Another mission was civilizing them, and I'm saying that in quotations. The schools reflecting the colonial belief that Indigenous people needed to be civilized or fit into Euro-Canadian society. So impact was incredible, as you can think of. While the state's objectives of residential schools were to educate and assimilate Indigenous children, their true impact was devastating. So systemic efforts to erase indigenous cultures and languages have led to loss of cultural heritage in many communities. And survivors of residential schools often suffered physical, emotional, sexual abuse, which has had lasting effects on indigenous families and communities. Also, it caused broken families. The forced separation of children from their families created cycles of disconnection, loss, and grief. And the vocational focus of education limited opportunities for advancement in perpetuating systemic inequalities. So there is Das Gupta 2000, and there is a quotation from that. Generations of depression, alcoholism, suicide, and family breakdown are the legacy of such traumatic experiences and are described as the residential school syndrome by Native peoples themselves. So the residential school system was a cornerstone of Canada's colonial project, aiming to forcibly assimilate Indigenous peoples and erase their cultural identities. Its lasting legacy of harm underscores the need for true reconciliation and meaningful efforts to restore Indigenous sovereignty and cultural resilience. And then I want to talk also about 60s scoop. The 60s scoop refers to the widespread removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities in Canada between 1950 and 1980s, with the peak occurring in 1960s. These children were placed in foster care or adopted into predominantly non-Indigenous families, often without the consent of families or communities. The 60s scoop was part of broader colonial policies aiming to assimilating Indigenous peoples and erasing their cultural practices or cultural identities. So the origins of this context shifts from residential schools to child welfare. It happened for a reason. As the residential school system began to decline in 20th century, Canadian governments turned to child welfare or child welfare agencies to assimilate Indigenous children. They didn't give up that goal they had or project they had. Social workers, often unfamiliar with Indigenous cultures, judged Indigenous homes by Eurocentric standards or the standards of whoever they thought is better placed or living better, civilized, deemed many as neglectful. So they judged them according to their belief systems. Amendments to Indian Act in 1951 allowed provincial child welfare services to intervene on reserves, and by the end of 1960s, provincial welfare systems removed thousands of Indigenous children under the guise of providing better opportunities. And the focus was, of course, on assimilation. The goal was to integrate them into Euro-Canadian society by placing them in non-Indigenous homes where they would adopt, of course, languages, religions, or any other cultural practices. So the main features of 60s scoop would be mass removal of children. Tens and thousands of children were taken from their families during this period, and adaptation into non-Indigenous families. Children were placed in non-Indigenous homes across Canada and United States. Of course, there are similar histories. Lack of consent. Families were often not consulted or informed about the removal of their children. And there was cultural costs because children were often discouraged or forbidden from practicing their traditions. So the consequences were very harmful. Many adoptees grew up disconnected from their Indigenous roots, leaving them feeling isolated and culturally displaced. Some faced racism and discrimination on their adoptive homes and communities. There was intergenerational trauma. Trauma of family separation compounded the effects of residential schools, creating cycles of grief and loss in Indigenous communities. There was breakdown of Indigenous communities, legal and social inequalities. Many adoptees were lost their Indian status under the Indian Act, facing difficulties reconnecting with their communities later in life. So that was 60th Scoop. And you have a 24-minute video over here, and this PowerPoint's on your canvas. Please watch that. Report by the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, it's 2016. It says serious social and economic conditions among many Indigenous peoples, including low life expectancy, inadequate education, high teenage pregnancy rates, high levels of incarceration, and overrepresentation in prisons, alcohol and substance abuse, overcrowded housing, poverty, and family breakdown. So this is the issues, some of them even in a deeper level discussed in this video. Please watch it. So there is a report by the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, 2016. Many Indigenous peoples, regardless of where they live, have difficulties finding employment due to discrimination and lower educational attainment than the general population. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which is also called RCAP, was established in 1991, delivered its comprehensive final report in 1996. This report provided the in-depth examination of social and economic conditions of Indigenous peoples in Canada. It highlighted significant disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, emphasizing the need for systemic reform. So, economic disparities, Indigenous communities faced higher rates of poverty and unemployment compared to the general Canadian population. Barriers such as limited access to resources, education, and economic opportunities contribute to these disparities. There were social challenges, such as Indigenous peoples experienced poorer health outcomes, including higher incidence of chronic disease and lower life expectancy. And as I mentioned earlier, it was about overrepresentation in the justice system, and then the historical policies, including residential schools, led to the erosion of cultural identities and languages. So there was recommendations from by the Royal Commission of Aboriginal People. Those living in remote, isolated areas are particularly disadvantaged. There was many different kinds of barriers, including access to important programs and services. As a result, Aboriginal people experienced many health disparities, unsafe housing conditions, and continuing poverty were some of the very serious issues. So skip generation families. Skip generation families refer to families, family structures where grandparents assume the primary caregiving role for their grandchildren, bypassing the middle parental generation. That's why it's called skip generation families. This family dynamic emerges when the biological parents are absent or unable to fulfill their parental responsibilities. So there was many reasons for skip generation families. There was substance abuse or addiction, incarceration of parents, mental and physical illnesses in societies, economic hardships. Parents facing financial instability may rely on the grandparents to raise their children. And there were some indigenous immigrant communities, extended families traditionally play caregiving role. There was trauma and crisis. So many different things going on that encouraged skip generation families in Aboriginal communities. So some of the skip generational family characteristics would be grandparents are caregivers, and generational gaps, legal and financial challenges, and the challenges they faced were grandparents may struggle to provide for grandchildren on fixed incomes such as retirement, pensions. There was health concerns. Older caregivers may face physical and mental health challenges due to the demands of caregiving. There was social isolation. Grandparents raising grandchildren can be isolating from their peers who are not in caregiving roles. And there was very strong emotional stress in these families. Some of the positive aspects of skip generation families were stability in the community. Grandparents often provided a stable environment, preserving family bonds and traditions. And there was like a resilience and strength. Many grandparents raise to the challenges of caregiving with determination and love, fostering strong relationship with their grandchildren. And also there was cultural transmission. So grandparents play a very important role in passing down cultural practices and values. So there was some financial assistance. Government programs and subsidies can help elevate economic challenges, and some community resources, legal support, and health counseling services to help these families. So in general, in conclusion, skip generation families exemplify resilience and adaptability in the face of challenges. While they often face significant social, emotional, and financial difficulties, the strong bonds formed between grandparents and grandchildren contribute to the preservation of family stability and continuity in indigenous families. Redressing historical injustices. So redressing historical injustices involves efforts to recognize, address, and rectify the harms caused by past actions or policies. They had disproportionately impacted indigenous families or marginalized communities. These injustices often stem from systems of colonization, slavery, racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression that have left lasting social, economic, and cultural scars. In the context of indigenous peoples and other historically oppressed groups, redress is a vital step toward healing and reconciliation. Some of the components of this redressing historical injustices would be acknowledgement and recognition, that public recognition of harm caused by historical injustices is the first step. Governments and institutions and organizations must formally acknowledge past wrongs, such as Indian Act, residential schools, slavery, forced assimilation, or land disposition. And accountability and apologies are very important. Official apologies from the governments, churches, and other entities that perpetuate the harm can help validate the experience of those affected. Apologies are basically symbolic, but also offer an opportunity to accept responsibility and begin to process the healing. Accountability involves ensuring those responsible for injustices recognize their role in perpetuating harm. Restitution and reparations are very important parts of this, redressing historical injustices. Restitution refers to the return of property or resources that were unjustly taken, such as land, money, cultural artifacts. Reparation, on the other hand, can involve financial compensations, other benefits to compensate for the economic, social, and cultural damages. Also, there is a education and a public awareness part. Educating the broader population about historical injustices is crucial to building understanding and empathy. Curricula building should include the history of marginalized communities, including impact of colonization, slavery, and systemic racism. Cultural revitalization can be part of that. That is that supporting the recovery of revitalization of languages, traditions, and cultures, healing and support for affected families and communities, providing social, psychological, and health support to individuals is very important part of it. So you see here the ending the cycle of family violence. There is a video and you need to watch that your own time. So there is a question for discussion. To what extent should the federal government develop policies and programs to redress many of the problems created by earlier policies? Some of the examples of redressing historical injustices can be Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. It was established to investigate the impact of residential schools on Indigenous children and communities. Its final report released in 2015, including 94 calls for action to address the legacy of residential schools and promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Also, reparation for slavery and colonialism in the United States, similarly in Canada, has taken steps towards that. Land back movements in Canada, Indigenous communities around the world, including in Canada, were advocating for land restitution and the return of land taken through colonization. In Canada, land claims settlement have provided compensation or the return of lands to Indigenous communities. These efforts restore territorial rights, bolster cultural heritage, and contribute to economic empowerments. So you can also think about this um, questions on your own time, and we will be discussing in class. So there are challenges to redressing historical injustices. There is political resistance. Political leaders and institutions may resist taking responsibility for past wrongs or hesitate to allocate resources for redress due to cost concerns or ideological oppositions. Also, economic and social inequalities, even when apologies or reparations deeply entrenched systemic inequalities may persist, and economic and social disparities may not be fully addressed, and there are intergenerational trauma. The lasting impact of indigenous injustices, especially trauma, has led that has been passed down through generations, can be probably very difficult to heal. It probably requires long-term and sustained efforts, and there is limits in the scope of reparations. In general, in conclusion, um, the history of domination and the attempts of colonial governments to assimilate indigenous people into Euro-Canadian societies done a lot of harm to these people. And indigenous people or families are on a path to healing. However, the process of reconciliation and efforts to reduce inequalities will take time. Redressing historical injustices is complex, multifaceted process that requires acknowledgement and accountability, restitution, and the restoration of rights. While much progress has been done in certain areas, including through truth commissions, land claims, and financial compensation, continued efforts are essential to address the long-lasting consequences of colonialism. So this is our today's conversation, and I will see you in our next classes. Bye.